I like this row because it's like why are you running PhD? But you're also fine the way that it's like you don't have to be. I like the way
Hi, nice to meet you. Yes, that's good. We've never seen each other in person. I realized how blonde you are. That sounds like a strange thing to say. Oh, yeah. Nice to meet you. Yes. How's it going? How's it going? Yeah, going well. Hey, Ben, how's it going? Shoot, that's awesome. Yeah. It's a hard act. When do you head to DC?
I don't know. You could be okay. I'm going out a bit early just to see friends and family.
Are you in Pacific or is that crowded? That sounds fun. Yeah,
it's like,
well, I'm from Chicago.
honestly, it sounded more lovely when I agreed to it, and now it's like, I actually could really use some time for work, so, but yeah.
Oh. Do you want to walk into the door?
Yeah. I am sorry to miss the undergraduate now.
You sure you missed a lot?
The mentor meeting.
Oh, yeah.
I don't do
yes,
that, guys.
sorry.
That's freezing in here.
Yeah.
Are you
sweating
comfortable?
constantly. It can be like arty, you know, and still be, that's just me, no, I'm fine.
Perfect, Friday, awesome. Sorry we had the conversation with that lady, I didn't even sit down.
No, don't worry about it, it's fine.
But yeah, we can have another batch.
Right.
How's it going? I'm good.
I'm debating.
I know. I miss life. We have to remake it. I saw those comments. I was so funny. Okay. Oh, I did too. And then I probably put it back.
No, but I think it's like that they've changed it.
He just circled COVID and like arrows. It's like
We are, but.
And we have to.
And that's the other thing is, we're going to out of this thing, we're going November 4th.
Oh, yeah.
Very sad.
It was. I simply don't know.
Alright, I'm gonna sit down.
Yes, you
Have my
too.
grapes.
Yeah. No, which one? I haven't
See what happens next.
Or the first one. I wrote 4 sentences. What grades did you want? Like it wasn't but it's just like it was right. Read my explanation was right, but it still wasn't right enough. Like you that 2 points would made a difference.
Oh. Upwards?
Upwards.
I don't know.
We didn't do so well. To bring our score down.
Hi. Good. How are you? Thanks for coming. Well, you can sit here. So we were waiting for
just for your presentation, if you wouldn't mind just going up the podium and just staying generally in that area, just so the mic can pick you up. If that's okay, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Is the clicker working?
Thanks for nailing down all the. Oh, for your software.
Taylor especially brings good people.
I try.
Hey, how are you?
So we tried to do 10 a semester. Yeah, so it's also part, going back to space, it's also like our community event, right? Every week we need something to get everyone together, right? And then it allows, puts us in a very fortunate position saying, hey, I want to learn about cyber, right? Yeah. One of the things I wanted to do a bit more of in our seminar, or whatever it is, and you can, so you can bring people in to just kind of help learn through new things. Yes. Yeah.
We need more people at the table.
Yes. One of the things I've learned as a director, most of my job is just the community. It's not really the research. I don't do any research of my own anymore.
And it's so nice for folks here. And then you get to hear what other people are doing. I thought it was. No, I know. It's funny.
Yes, we'll get people. We now offer food, so give people a minute to feed themselves.
At least one day in a week you get.
Well, so we kind of had this forum last year asking people, because we had this hybrid format, we weren't really sure if it was working, find some feedback, and so most of the feedback was bring back the food, not whether the hybrid format was working or where's the food?
I didn't. No.
There's so many vendors that you can do it on campus too, but you don't have to. It's usually better to do it. But now on campus folks are not as
I was up in the mountains.
not quite as tasty. So let's see.
I didn't do anything. 300.
So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the MIT SSP Wednesday Seminar. I'm Taylor Fravel, Director of the Security Studies Program. It's my great pleasure to welcome William Akoto to MIT. He's an assistant professor at Fordham University in New York. He researches the political economy dynamics of international trade, coup d'etats, and cyber conflict. His work has appeared in a variety of leading journals in the field. Before coming to Fordham, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the One Earth Future Foundation and the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. And he received his PhD in political science from the University of South Carolina, in 2019. So William, it's a real pleasure to have you here today. He's going to speak on how Russia uses cyber proxies to respond to accusations of cyber attacks. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you everybody as well for. So
mic, yes. Awesome. Yeah, so thank you everybody as well for being here. And everybody streaming in and watching online later, thank you as well. So this work, it's sort of the core of it, right? The case study is based on how Russia uses cyber proxies to respond to accusations of cyber attack. But I'm hoping to make sort of a broader point really about how nations or sort of accused states respond to accusations of cyber malfeasance, right? So, and this is still a work in progress. I'm just starting to write it up. So as always, thoughts and prayers are welcome. All right, so sort of almost every now and then, almost every other day, we hear reports in the news about sort of some state-sponsored cyber attack incident, right? So say for instance, Chinese hackers have been accused of, say, stealing a lot of sort of intellectual property assets from US firms. Just recently, Russian hackers were sort of allegedly knocked off several US airport websites. Thankfully, the sort of disruptions were minimal for this. And then also, of course, the North Koreans not wanting to be left out, right? They have also been really active, hacking everything from healthcare services to our financial services industry, transportation service providers, etc., right? And as this sort of state-sponsored cyber activity has increased, states are also increasingly, at least the targeted states, are also increasingly now sort of beginning to publicly attribute these attacks to the state sponsors. So say, for instance, just recently the US indicted several Iranian hackers for attacks on our sort of critical infrastructure systems. They were accused of sort of getting into our healthcare, transportation, several utility companies, as well as the systems of several state and local government agencies as well. There's also been indictments issued against Chinese hackers as well. We indicted 12 of them back in 2018. North Koreans have also been hit with several indictments as well. Right, so the sort of increasing spate of state-sponsored cyber attacks, coupled with this increasing tendency for states to actually want to publicly attribute these attacks, that has generated quite a significant amount of interest among cyber politics scholars. Here I want to focus specifically on the sort of attribution aspect of it, but there's quite a lot of work as well just on the sort of state-sponsored cyber attack side of things as well. So just on the attribution side of things, we can split the attribution sort of process into three main phases. The sort of pre-attribution phase, which is sort of the process leading up to attribution. There has been sort of a good amount of work examining the dynamics there. So say, for instance, researchers have looked into the effect of using cyber proxies. These are just non-state actors who sort of hack on behalf of a state sponsor. We have looked at why, say, for instance, some attackers would voluntarily claim credit for cyber attacks. We've looked at the effect that, say, for instance, the framing of these public attribution claims, right? How that framing is constructed, right? So there is a good amount of work on this. And then just on the attribution process itself, that has also generated some interest. So we've looked at, say, for instance, the challenges that are posed by private cyber security companies getting involved in this attribution process. We have spoken, or at least researchers have looked at the various incentives that these private cybersecurity or cyber threat intelligence companies have, because they are profit-making firms after all, and they have chief executives and boards that are politically active, right? Some of them, and so that could sort of allow various biases to creep in. And then there's also been a good examination of sort of the various technical and legal sort of measures that we can use to sort of attribute state-sponsored cyber attacks. What is lacking is the sort of third phase of it, the post-attribution phase, right? So what happens after a state is accused of cyber attacks? There we know very little, right? So I think that's sort of as far as the literature has gotten. And so in a particular sort of sense, we know very little about, say, for instance, how accused states react to the accusations, and where there is a reaction, what the sort of strategic considerations are, right, that guide the actions of the accused states, and then also the sort of specific venues or avenues that they use to push back if that's what they're doing against these accusations. And the sort of trying to figure this stuff out is, at least in my view, important because it feeds into sort of ways in which we can develop much more effective mechanisms to, say, counter malicious state-sponsored cyber activity. It is important, especially for sort of debates around how we build public and international support to take retaliatory action. And then even just on the side of the victims, right? But it also, it's important, right? In terms of figuring out the sort of prospects for them getting retribution for the attacks. And so that's sort of what this project, or at least in my view, that's what I was trying to sort of get at with this project, is sort of try to sort of help push the literature forward a little bit in this angle. So I developed a theoretical framework that sort of tries to help us better understand what the sort of strategic motives are for states attributing cyber attacks, and then what the sort of considerations would be for the accused state, right, in terms of their response to these attacks. In terms of the sort of motives for the attack, sort of states attribute cyber attacks publicly for various reasons. There is a good amount of sort of literature on that helps us make sense of sort of why states would do that. One of which is just oftentimes when there is an attack, there is often pressure on the government to sort of do something about it, right? So just being able to come out and sort of publicly attribute these attacks helps to just show that we're doing something about it, right? It also is important in terms of helping the IT security community in sort of preventing future attacks, particularly if it's from the very same threat actors using very similar or the same methods. And then it can also disrupt relationships, right? Because if we shine a spotlight on the sort of hackers and the various state cyber operatives that are behind these attacks, it can give the state pause, right, in terms of deciding whether to work with these particular hackers. Again, so now that their sort of cover has been blown, right? So that. But much more importantly is that attribution is important for building public support and international support to take retaliatory action against the accused state, right? When the government presents its case as to why it suspects another state of sponsoring an attack, it is essentially making a case for whatever sort of retaliatory action follows next. Usually, after the attribution claim has been made, it's often followed by sanctions or some kind of retributory actions, criminal indictments, etc. Right? So essentially, that is to make a case for that. And the literature shows that there's sort of possibility of retaliatory action matters a great deal to the state sponsors, right? So in fact, there is literature to suggest that the fear of retaliation could be a significant reason why some states might hold back from sort of engaging in state-sponsored cyber attacks. And that tracks, right? Because the sort of cost of retaliation can be severe. Oftentimes, it involves sanctions, right? Import and export restrictions, and that can have a devastating effect, right? I have a paper that looks at the relationship between trade and state-sponsored cyber attacks. It's a fine paper, please read it. Right, but it sort of speaks to those issues. And then, of course, the sort of regime elites behind the attack oftentimes could face targeted sanctions, asset freezes, travel bans, and so on. Obviously, that's not fun for them, right? So they want to avoid that as well. And then states could also take covert action where they could say essentially hack back, right, against these states. So given these costs, right, a fundamental aim for any state sponsoring an attack is to limit the possibility that they face retaliatory action. And so in that sense, I argue that one way in which they can do this is to sort of cast doubt on the attribution claims, right? Because the attribution claims is how we're building support for the retaliatory action. So if I can dispute the sort of attribution claim, then that can help limit the likelihood that any retaliatory action follows from the attack. And so I make the case that there are various sort of deficiencies, especially in the sort of attribution process that facilitates accused states being able to sort of push back against attributory claims. Some of these deficiencies are operational, where there are various questions about the accuracy of the methods that we're using to really sort of determine who is responsible for these cyber attacks. Some of the deficiencies are structural. For instance, these cyber threat intelligence companies that oftentimes are critical in identifying the sources of these attacks. Again, as we said, they have various biases, right? One of which is their sort of motive to make a profit, and so in that sense, they have the tendency to sort of hype up particular threats from certain quarters, because it could lead to sort of big business down the line. And then there are various sort of technical issues as well, right? People hacking obviously use various methods to hide their tracks, false flag operations. Some of them use sort of off-the-shelf software. All of that makes it particularly difficult, right, to sort of pinpoint attribution. And that can be sort of leveraged by the states that are responsible for these operations in order to sort of push back. And then to make matters worse, we are having to make these attributory claims in a heavily contested information environment where, say, for instance, now we live in an era where there are facts and alternative facts, right? So in that, it makes it really hard to do that. And so for the sort of case sort of study to help illustrate this sort of framework, I focus on Russian sort of cyber influence operations. Could go back one. Yes, so I focus on Russian cyber influence operations, particularly in the lead up to the 2016 US elections in the US. As we all know, the US and sort of Russia have a long-standing rivalry, right? It sort of cooled down a little bit in the aftermath of the sort of Cold War, but it has reignited again recently as sort of Russia has become more regionally and internationally assertive. And so the US has accused Russia of various sort of state-sponsored cyber influence operations, oftentimes with the aim of sort of trying to influence the American political system. And we have sort of shown the spotlight, particularly on the Internet Research Agency, which is based in Petersburg. It's also known as the Troll Farm, right? Where they have sort of a large number of employed people whose job it is to sort of inject themselves into various conversations and sort of try to push the government's propaganda, and even sort of whoever is willing to pay them. So in this sense, data from sort of Twitter shows that IRA controlled accounts and various sort of Russian proxy accounts just in the lead up to the 2016 elections in the US and sort of in the period immediately following sent somewhere around 175,000 tweets. In 2018, there was a lot of pressure to do something about these sort of Russian influence operations. And so the US grand jury here indicted 13 Russian nationals and singled out the IRA for sort of being a particularly active actor, right, in that. So in that sense, we are interested at least in seeing how Russia has sort of pushed back against these accusations of cyber interference. The official response is often very sort of terse, right? It's we didn't do it, right? It's you ask them, obviously you ask them, did you do it? They said, no, we didn't do it, right? And they didn't do it. But they often say, no, these accusations are sort of Russophobic, they are sort of groundless, and sort of they lack evidence, and the evidence presented, there is no evidence, right? And then at the same time, oftentimes the sort of high-ranking government officials will sometimes actually praise and sort of valorize the hackers that have been indicted, right, for these sort of cyber offenses. Oftentimes they claim they are just patriots that are defending the honor of Russia against baseless accusations from the US. And oftentimes they will sort of point the finger right back and say, well, America is hacking us too, right? So, and we don't see you talking about it, right? So why is it always just Russia, 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 right? But this official response, at least it looks to me to be really sort of muted, right? Because given the sort of serious consequences of sort of the potential retaliatory action that could follow, we would expect a much more sort of vigorous response, right? And so maybe that's happening unofficially, right? Sort of offline, using these sort of cyber proxies and trolls to push back much more vigorously against these accusations. Because oftentimes when they do respond, it's really just a sort of a one line, we didn't do it, right? And oftentimes they completely will sort of ignore, right? And even that could be strategic because we don't want to sort of dignify the allegations with a response. So even that is our way of sort of trying to minimize the accusations. But I thought, well, let's look at the sort of online, sort of online, right? The unofficial response. We know that the IRA is often really active, right, in terms of sort of injecting itself into the public discourse and pushing the state's propaganda, and so that could be happening online. So I look at Twitter, right? They are active on several platforms as well, but I focus here on their operations on Twitter. In this regard, the data for the analysis come from sort of Twitter's election integrity data set. What Twitter does is Twitter is against Twitter's sort of user rules, right, to have sort of coordinated state-sponsored propaganda operations on Twitter. And so sort of Twitter looked out for that. And so when it discovers activity that looks to be sort of coordinated state-sponsored propaganda, it takes down the content, bans the accounts, but it makes the tweets available along with the metadata, right, for researchers. So that's what I sort of base it on. I am mainly interested in how Russia sort of interacts with, at least tries to sort of push back by targeting messaging at US-based audiences or sort of the broader English-speaking world. And so out of the sort of universe of tweets that are sent, I sort of narrow it down to just the English language tweets, and then I narrow it down further to just the tweets that are relevant to sort of cyber attacks. So tweets that sort of talk about cyber attacks or hacking or sort of try to push back against those accusations. So the analysis is based on just over 3,400 tweets from 287 of these proxy accounts. These tweets were sent between July 2010 and February of 2020. And so just to give us a sense of the sort of timeline for these tweets, we can see that the bulk of it is sort of always starts just in the lead up to the 2016 election, but the bulk of it is actually in the sort of post-election period, right, where it peaks, and then all the way up to the sort of 2018 midterms. And that's really when these proxies were sort of actively sort of tweeting about Russian cyber operations. The analysis proceeds in sort of 4 steps. First, I use a topic modeling algorithm and an unsupervised topic modeling algorithm that sort of uses a bag of words approach. So essentially, all that it does is I feed the tweets in, and the algorithm sort of tries to sort them into various topics based on the sort of themes in the tweets. And then after that, I use a semantic network analysis to examine what the relationships are between the various topics, right? In terms of how do they share, right? Do they share common words and so forth? And then how do the different topics then relate to each other? And then I use community detection algorithms also to detect linkages between the various topics, because there are some topics that are tweeted by particular accounts only. And so just trying to see if particular topics are tweeted by particular accounts. And then as the sort of final step, I try to see what the sort of favored linguistic sort of rhetorical devices that are used in these tweets. So these are the relevant topics that I identified. There were 11 of them. Here I have arranged them in terms of the sort of number of tweets per topic. At the top are tweets that mainly sort of aim to cast doubt on hacking accusations, right? So when an accusation has been made, there are some tweets that are just geared towards casting doubt on whatever the sort of evidence is that was presented to suggest that it was Russian hackers behind the attack. There are some tweets that are specifically aimed at sort of trying to refute that evidence. And then a good amount of the tweets were also just sort of retweets of various sort of cyber hacking incident reports. So when there's a new sort of cyber hack somewhere that is alleged to involve not just Russian hackers, but others from China, Iran, and so forth, you also sometimes have them being retweeted by these proxy accounts. And then there are some accounts, or there are some tweets that are geared towards criticizing the people who are making these allegations. So it could be, say, for instance, whoever the government official is, or sort of US congressperson, or whoever, or even like media personalities who are sort of speaking about these cyber attacks or alleged sort of Russian-involved cyber attacks. There are tweets that often target and criticize those people specifically. There are some that focus specifically on issues relating to the sort of emails from the staffers of Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign that were hacked and then released to WikiLeaks that then came out. And there are tweets that sort of aim to highlight particular content from that email, right? Sort of to fan the flames around that. And then there are those tweets that just sort of flatly deny that Russia was involved, right, in the sort of tweets at all, sort of seeming to suggest that it is actually absurd to even suggest that Russia was involved in any way within tweets. And then there are some that sort of redirect, right? So some that sort of try to shed light on or draw attention to accusations of US government hacking, right? So hacking, say, or alleged hacking by the CIA, NSA, and so forth. There are sort of those tweets that aim to sort of shed light on those, right? So they would tweet out about that. And then some, again, still on the sort of hacked emails, but this time highlighting the fact that maybe, for instance, that Hillary is not legitimately elected, right? That somehow she was favored in the presidential nomination process, and so nomination is somehow tainted, right? And again, sort of using a lot of evidence from these hacked emails to make the point. And then some also that talk about hacking by Democrats, especially some accusations that the Obama administration, for instance, was trying to interfere with the election systems of several Republican-led states, again, in the lead up to the 2016 election and 2018 sort of midterms as well. And then also retweets of various hacktivism reports as well, we see that. And then some tweets that focus on the leaking of, again, the sort of DNC emails. And then there are those that just blame the victim, right, for the attack. So we'll look at, we can't go through all of them, we'll look at just a few of them, just to see. So say, for instance, the tweets that sort of cast doubt on them, a lot of them are use very salty language, so I've tried to at least bring the more tamer ones, right? So this is one that says, well, the Russian hacking was a false flag by the CIA. It was done to give Obama a reason to spy on Trump. Another one talks about the NSA whistleblower, William Biney. It says the US intelligence did the DNC hack. Hillary wants war with Russia to cover up her crimes. The Russia hack is now being exposed for a lie by Washington. Real CIA agents say this is an outright lie, and so on. Right here, these tweets are just want to sort of cast doubt on the fact that on whatever actual evidence was presented to support the tweets. And just to give sort of a timeline of where these, because these tweets appear to sort of peak at particular times. So say, for instance, when there were reports on how the US could respond to Russian hacking, right? There was one of the days sort of in the middle of 2017 thereabout, there were sort of a huge news coverage about how America can sort of push back against Russian hacking operations. On that day, we saw a lot of these tweets that are sort of aimed at sort of pushing back against the evidence that was presented. Also, when news reports came out to allege that it was Russia that hacked the DNC, again, on that day, there was a lot of these sort of doubting tweets, these sort of doubt-flavored tweets as well. And so they sort of tend to peak at times when there is sort of talk of, or at least some evidence being presented or injected in the public domain, right, about what these hackers are alleged to have done. And then those tweets that sort of deny Russian involvement, again, these are a few of them. So the Russians successfully hacked the Electoral College vote, but messed up by multiple millions of votes on the popular vote, sort of trying to mock the idea that, you know, how is it that the Russians sort of knew, and the second tweet was saying, you know, knew how to hack the popular vote for Hillary, but then hack the electoral vote for Trump, right? So again, sort of trying to make it seem absurd, right, that Russia had anything to do with it. Right, and so the same amount of evidence exists for man-made climate change as Russia's hacking of the election and whatsoever. It appears they don't believe in climate change. Again, with sort of a timeline, these sort of denial-flavored tweets tend to break at particular times, right? So here, one sort of day where the CIA came out with sort of more evidence to suggest that Russia didn't just interfere in the election, but that they actually did so to favor Trump. Prior to this, the sort of narrative was that Russia did interfere or did hack the DNC servers, but it wasn't clear which side they were leaning. On this day, the CIA was sort of came out, and there were at least news reports that appear to suggest a much more sort of conclusive leaning, right? And on that day, then we saw a lot of these sort of denial-flavored tweets being put out. And then also on the day when President Obama sort of vowed to take retaliatory action against Russia for hacking, again, we saw a lot of these denial tweets being put forward. And then there were also tweets that criticize those who were sort of making or at least sort of trying to emphasize the fact that Russia was involved. One tweet says there's absolutely zero evidence that Russia hacked any votes in elections. Can you idiots go away? Why did the Dems didn't let the FBI look at their servers? One tweeted at Nigel Farage that if Russia actually hacked anything, they hacked Obama's brains, found nothing and moved on, right? Out, right? But that's, you know, that's some of the tweets. So these are more sort of tweets that are targeted at individuals, right? Those media commentators, media personalities, people who are sort of trying to, or at least in their view, trying to sort of push the idea that Russia was involved. And again, timeline-wise, we see this peaking at particular times. So one such incident when the Fancy Bears group, which is a Russian cyber hacking group, was named in a US government report on cyber attacks. On that day, again, we saw a lot of these tweets that specifically criticize media personalities and people who were actively reporting on this. Also, when cybersecurity firms confirmed that Russian hackers were indeed involved in the DNC hack as well. We saw again a lot of these tweets that are aimed at criticizing the actual personalities, right, behind these accusations. And then finally, let's look at the sort of victim blaming sort of flavor of the tweets. These ones sort of oftentimes tend to highlight various security lapses that made it possible for the hacking to occur in the first place. And then also sort of some of it is really sort of giving advice, right, in terms of how to be more cyber secure. So apparently the NSA left catastrophic flaws in US networks that aided the offense and so on, right? So a lot of these are just meant to sort of put the blame on the victim. And again, we tend to peak at particular times. So when, say, for instance, there were various news reports about why Russian cybercrime is thriving or why we're seeing so much of it, we saw a lot of these tweets that sort of tend to want to blame various security lapses on the victim's side of things. And then finally, I looked at sort of the various sort of linguistic rhetorical devices that these trolls appear to favor, right? They tend to oftentimes tweet and retweet particular tweets that use particular sort of linguistic devices, right? They like tweets that say things in a particular way, right? So you sort of tend to see that in a lot of the tweets and a lot of retweets, it's the same sort of rhetorical devices keep showing up over and over again. These are the sort of main ones. Oh, before we get there, this is the semantic network analysis. So that the nodes here are the various topics, and the edges connecting them are just sort of how common the words are between the various topics. The edges are weighted according to the sort of frequency of co-occurring words, and the clusters are the sort of color codes. So say, for instance, accounts that tend to tweet a lot about sort of the DNC leaks were also really active in tweeting about sort of denials, right, in terms of Russian hacking. And then the accounts that tweeted a great deal about the hacked emails were also oftentimes the same accounts that were tweeting things criticizing those behind making the allegation. Right, so at least this suggests that there is some coordination, right, going on behind the scenes. Right? It looks like certain accounts are designated for particular purposes, and they are given a particular task, right, to complete. So the rhetorical devices that they appear to favor, one of which is they sort of appear to favor tweets that employ, say, for instance, minimization, right? So say, for instance, saying that even a 14-year-old kid could have hacked Podesta's emails, right? So, and there are several such tweets that sort of tend to want to minimize the accusations. And then they like also ones that use a lot of sort of name calling, right? So say, for instance, this one that calls Obama sort of a dirty, filthy poor excuse for illegal. They really don't like Obama. And then they also sort of favor ones that use mockery a lot. So this, my favorite one, right, where they hacked Obama's brains and found nothing and moved on. So those ones. They also like scapegoating tweets, right? Tweets that use a lot of scapegoating, sort of try to shift the blame onto someone else. So say, for instance, NSA left flaws that then allowed them to hack. Also, sometimes they like tweets that have a lot of sort of speculation in them. So this one where there is a suspicion that the DHS hacked various election systems in Republican-led states. And then they also like tweets that sort of push absurdity, so to sort of convey the notion that it is absurd, right, that Russia was involved. So sort of on the whole, I see this project really as sort of trying to at least get us to start thinking a great deal more about sort of what happens in the sort of post-attribution phase, because if we have a good understanding of how the nations are pushing back and responding to these accusations, then that could sort of help to develop at least much more effective means to counter state-sponsored activities. It's also important as for social media sort of scholars and social media companies to sort of understand exactly sort of how these social media platforms are often being coerced and used to push state-sponsored propaganda. So that's where I'm at, starting the write-up, like I said. So hopefully I can get it written up, and then it'll be up to the peer review gods, right, to see when this sees the light of day. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So I'll keep a list of questions. If you could just raise your hand high. And Elizabeth, I saw you first, so you get the first question, but everyone else, hands up, please. Okay.
People have good questions.
Yeah.
I'm particularly interested in your finding that there are more tweets about the doubt, putting doubt on it than outright denial. And it seems to be there are a couple possible explanations why you would go spread doubt rather than out. So if you say denial, then it assumes that you actually know, and so you don't want to do that. But I'm wondering, there's a lot of scholarship now on the information ecosystem in Russia, arguing that doubt has been sown deliberately to make everything more complicated, more messy. And I'm wondering whether your research is robust enough yet to comment on this sort of role of doubt per se. Nothing is trustworthy. You can't trust, throwing every contradictory explanation at the wall, throwing every contradictory fact at the wall to make it all one big confused pile. Do you think that is part of what's going on here, or is it early yet for your research to comment?
Oh, no, I mean, yeah, I mean, you say it very well, right? That's exactly what's going on, right? Because if you can sort of muddy the waters enough, then nothing means anything, right? And so then we can get away with anything, because we can never say for sure about anything, So yeah, that's exactly what's going on.
Great, thanks. Next, Ben Harris.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm a fourth-year PhD student. I really find it interesting. Obviously, the tweets themselves are both funny and a bit depressing. I'm curious about the incentives for the accusing states. And it seems like this is an interesting case where, like in literature on covert operations from Carson, states have an incentive to hide other states' involvement in order to de-escalate. And similarly, from one of our own professors, Eric Lee Greenberg, for remote warfighting technology, states also have an incentive to de-escalate when things like drones are lost. So I'm curious, in the cyber realm, it also seems like a place of like murky attribution. There can be incentives to de-escalate, and instead you're finding that states are actually more aggressive and accusing others of hacking. So I'm curious why you don't see those same incentives to de-escalate on either side of the equation.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's good. I think what's happening in the cyber realm, especially when it comes to cyber attacks, these state-sponsored cyber attacks, is oftentimes there's really a lot of pressure on government to do something about it, right? Because if, say, for instance, the media is putting out so much news and information about sort of Russia or China or Iran or Syria or some other state-sponsored actor sort of hacking US firms and industries, and it looks like the US government is not doing anything about it, it makes the government look bad, or it makes us look like we're not up to task, right, in terms of our cybersecurity. So I suspect that there's a lot of the sort of incentive to publicly attribute is in response to just the tremendous pressure that government is increasingly facing to respond in some way to these cyber attacks. And especially in the lead up to the 2016 election and following, right? You had a lot of sort of pressure on, at least in the final years of the Obama administration, and then in the first few years of the Trump administration as well, to do something about this, right? And so in that sense, I think, although there are incentives to de-escalate because you don't want to make the situation worse, I think there's also pressure for government to respond. And I think in this case, that pressure is what's driving states to sort of try to at least push back and to attribute this.
And do you have a two finger? Is this your one finger?
Two fingers.
Okay.
Following directly on Ben's comment, how do we know whether there is an escalatory or de-escalatory tendency? Because we're sampling on publicly accepted cases rather than a universe of cases that will include a lot of more subtle cases. So basically, two finger is don't necessarily believe this guy.
Good advice in general.
But don't disbelieve him. How do we know? And your sampling is going to be obviously on public cases. It's sort of like the same question on covert action.
Yeah. No, it can be. It's a challenge, right? Because the cyber sort of incidents that do come to the surface is what we know, and so there's a whole sort of universe of cases that we will just never know about, right? And so in that sense, yeah, we can only be as sure as the data will allow us, and we know that there's a huge chunk missing. Yeah, so we work with what we can.
And those are the cases where the US chose not to escalate.
Yeah.
Okay.
Gina Miller.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was a really interesting talk. I'm a third year and I also do some work on attribution, so I really enjoyed this. And so I wondered if we could talk some more about sort of connecting the theory you discussed with your findings. And so correct me if I misunderstood this, but it sounded like you were describing these sort of technical and operational issues with attribution where the targeted state really is not confident in what happened. And so even when they make these public attribution claims, they don't believe it that strongly themselves. And so when the accused state denies the claims, there's less likely to be a retaliation because the targeted state really isn't actually sure what happened. And so this is really a story about like retaliation and trying to deter or sort of prevent the possibility of retaliation. And so I wonder if you could discuss specifically in this case about Russian information operations, if you think retaliation is really the motive here, if you think that's the driving concern, and how you can determine motive by looking at tweets from these proxy groups, which as you discussed seem to be sort of about sowing doubt more broadly. Thank you.
Well, yeah, thanks. So I think, yeah, in a broad sense of it, because the retaliation can be severe, right? We don't see retaliation that frequently, but then sort of in the last few years, when the attribution has sort of ramped up, there is becoming increasingly much more, at least states are becoming increasingly much more likely to actually take retaliatory action. So say, for instance, President Obama sort of expelled several Russian diplomats in response to the hacks. We have imposed sanctions, some trade sanctions on Russia as well in response to its hacking operations. And so there are retaliations, right? And even the sort of suspected hackers behind it have also faced some travel restrictions. A lot of them are subject to arrest if we can never get our hands on them. And so those consequences are ones that are one that we can sort of imagine no state, or at least these people would rather not face these consequences. And so what we see in the tweets are sort of that pushback against this, right? And so we can, at least one way to actually sort of interpret that is to say, well, it sort of lines up, or it's consistent with what we would expect if they were concerned about at least trying to minimize the possibility of retaliation.
Okay, do you have a two finger here?
Yes.
Is this your one finger?
It leads into, yes.
Leads into, okay.
So a third finger and then a question about
Okay.
theory. So sort of picking up on what Nina was talking about, I'm curious if sort of what you're conceptualizing as attribution. And I think that matters for understanding the retaliatory or the response, because it wasn't clear to me what counted as retaliation and if this response, or sorry, what counted as attribution and if they're responding to the attribution or if they're responding to the sanctions. And so I don't know if that matters, if the sanctions are part of attribution, but I was wondering what you meant by attribution, because there were sanctions also imposed. It wasn't just a statement of the term attribution. And then from the victim's perspective, this is my one finger, from the victim's perspective, the strategic motivation to attribute the attack. I'm curious if your theory, if it matters whether there's motivation to attribute the attack to somebody, anybody in Russia was responsible versus this was the Russian government, and how that might matter for the response by the Russian government, in this case, or in any government in general.
Well, thank you. Yes. Oftentimes the attribution, right, it happens before the sanctions, right? So those things, those two things are separate. So they would first be, a public statement of some sort, trying to sort of lay out a case for why we think this particular state sponsor was behind an attack. And so in that sense, oftentimes we will see that when those announcements are made, right, then we would see these sort of spikes in the tweets. I didn't look in the case of what happens when the sanctions come, right, because that could be something else. I just wasn't, like, the tweets were subset specifically to look at the
tweet.
Yeah, yes. But I mean, that could be another project as well. Yeah, just to look at, because we can neatly separate out in most cases, right? Not always, but in most cases, separate out the attribution from the actual retaliatory action. It might be possible then to see if the response is different, right? In that sense. And then in terms of sort of attributing it specifically, I think the proxies care both about it being attributed specifically to the government, and then it's just being attributed to Russian hackers, right? Because I suspect that some of these Russian hackers are themselves working for the IRA or are sort of trolls themselves. And so in that sense, if I am the person who has just been indicted and I'm the one running these accounts, of course I'm going to sort of try to tweet out and try and dispute whatever. But then at the same time, they also paid employees to push state propaganda as well. So if it's against the government, even if it's not specifically against any particular hacker, again, I have the incentive to push back. So in both cases.
I'm going to jump in here real quickly, just a clarifying question. Are you looking at any kind of attribution, whether it's from a private company or from the United States government, or are you only looking at attribution by sort of the US government itself?
In this case, most of the tweets were responding to attribution by the US government.
By the US government.
Yeah, but I think, and so in this sense, at least it appears as if these proxies care mostly about the attribution from the government and not so much from the private cybersecurity companies, which again then leads us to suspect that they care about the retaliatory action that might follow. Because if it's the government attributing it, then that's much more serious than if it's just the private companies saying Russia did it. They may not be able to follow up with any retaliatory action, so why bother?
Great, okay, good. Nasli.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. A couple of dilemmas here, maybe you can help clarify. The notion of attribution is related to the claim that they done it, something like that. In the old days, we used to think, and I still think, that attribution, operational attribution, he done it, it done it, it still remains a little bit murky technologically. Sometimes we can, sometimes we can't. And what I find very interesting is that you sidestep this because you don't need it for your analysis. So ideally, I would have liked to ask you, well, how did they actually operationally, technologically produce the attribution? But that's not what you do. The question I have is, why is it? What's your intuition about why the Russians in that entity that you talked about, or the tweeters or whatever, don't use anonymizing techniques. I would have expected that if they're really serious about this, Tor is there, Ghost Tor and so forth would be very helpful. Is it that they won't be bothered? Or is it that they actually do want to be observed and identified? This is not something I know about, but it struck me as a missing piece of their behavior not accounted for.
Yeah, thank you as well. For the first point about the sort of operational or sort of technical attribute, like how do we know they did it? Yeah, oftentimes the government is not.
Doesn't need.
They are not even clear about exactly how they know, right? Because and there is a strategic sort of motive there, because they don't want to put out too much information about how did we figure out that it was the Russians. Because if they know how we know, then they are going to figure out a way around that, right? Because if I tell you exactly how I'm figuring out that it's you, then you could sort of conceivably then devise ways to evade that, right? And so I think on a strategic level, the government or whoever is making the attribution claim has an incentive to be vague about exactly how we know it's you. And that's what we see, right? So they don't necessarily put out a lot of sort of independently verifiable information for us to know specifically that it was X and Y that did it, right? So
I believe that. I
yeah.
think you're right. Of course you're right.
And then in terms of sort of the behavior of the proxies, right, in terms of sort of hiding their tracks, they do try, right? They try very hard to hide their tracks. A lot of their tweets, they sort of compose some of the tweets themselves, but a large part of it is also just retweeting what other people are saying, right? So, and I suspect some of this may just be, you are a public servant, right? And if somebody else is doing your job for you, why bother, right? So you just retweet what they're tweeting because they're saying what you wanted to say anyway. And some of them may be a language issue, right? These are Russian language speaking proxies. English might not be, their sort of preferred mode of communication, and so it might be difficult for them to sort of craft a tweet that can work. And so if they see one that somebody else has written that says what they want to say, they tweet out. And so they try to do that and sort of
multiply text.
Yes, exactly. Retweeting, as opposed to just sort of creating your own tweet, also has a benefit in terms of the rules that sort of Twitter uses to determine coordinated state-sponsored cyber operations, right? Because presumably the punishment for just retweeting is less than if you are the actual originator of the content, right? And so they try using various means to hide their tracks. And at the same time, then these social media platforms also then try to, they're also very vague about exactly how do we even know that these tweets are state-sponsored? They don't exactly tell you, right? So they're like, just trust us on this, these are state-sponsored. Yeah, so there's a lot of murkiness.
Rich Fielson. Hey, sorry, Eric has a two-finger, Rich.
Yeah, I apologize. I just wanted to follow up on both of these questions, actually, the one that Nina posed earlier as well as the last one, and ask a little bit more about the motivation for these counters, right, these counterclaims. So in the case of China, I forgot the name of the company, it changed its name partway through all of this, but there was, quite a bit of technical material put out, not by the US government, but by the security firm, as to the forensics of how they determined that this was China operatives. None of what you've shown us are really, of course, technical counters. So it seems like all of the tweets that you're talking about are really targeting the same group that the original attack targeted. So in that sense, I guess, I'd be interested to hear your reaction about whether that's really trying to avoid, whether the motivation then is really trying to avoid the potential sanctions, in which case you would actually want to convince the guys in the NSA. None of this is going to convince them in any way, shape, or form, right? or whether this is just sort of a continuation of the attack, right? So they've tried to block the US government, tried to block the effects of the attack by demonstrating that it's a cyber attack. And now what the Russians are following up with are, doubts about those claims, but not a technical rebuttal in any way, shape, or form. So maybe there's other material that's not on Twitter, but these clearly seem aimed at the target of the original attacks.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. These tweets, I think, are more aimed at just trying to inject themselves, or at least trying to affect public opinion support, right, for any sort of potential retaliatory action, right? Because oftentimes the likelihood that there will be a retaliatory action to follow, whether some sanctions or asset freezes or something, oftentimes that comes from pressure that either the public is putting on the government to do something about it, or firms, right? These firms, Sony and the big companies, Netflix and so on, that have been hacked. And these firms put pressure on the government to essentially do something about it. And so I think they don't care so much about the sort of technical attribution aspects of it. They did it. They know that they did it. So there isn't, I don't think there's any sort of treasure trove evidence there that they have to suggest that they didn't do it, right? Once we know you did it, you did it. And unless if you didn't do it, then and you have sort of evidence to prove that you didn't do it, then you will almost likely also have some evidence to point to who actually did it. And I don't think they have that. So what's going on here is them just, I suspect, trying to influence sort of public opinion and international support for retaliatory action. Because oftentimes the US, when we impose sanctions, we try to get our allies as well to join in on and sort of try to join. And so if we can sort of muddy the waters enough that we don't necessarily believe that these people did it, right? How were they, say, for instance, how were they able to hack the right number of votes for Trump in the sort of electoral college, but couldn't manage to pull that off in the popular? So if we can sow doubts like that, then it makes it harder for the US to build like a coalition of support to actually punish them for it. So I suspect they care about the likelihood of punishment. And so, yeah, you can claim that we did it, that's fine. But so long as there are no consequences for what we have done to it, they seem to be good. So I suspect they care more about the potential consequences rather than, so a lot of the bulk of the efforts is focused on sort of trying to shape public opinion around that, to make sure that there isn't that strong support, that groundswell of support to push for retaliation.
It also keeps the attack alive, though.
Yeah.
Hey, Rich Nielsen, associate professor here. So actually, this is perfect because we're on almost exactly the same wavelength. So I wanted to propose a different hypothesis as well, which is very close to Eric's. So your hypothesis, as I understood it, is this is about the fear of retaliation. And I had basically the same thought, that I was like, these tweets have nothing to do with the probability that the US retaliates. Your rebuttal, as I understand it, is something like, well, they're trying to change, yes, the US government is not going to be persuaded by these tweets, but public opinion might shift as a result of these tweets. I'm not convinced on that, but I think your data and some metadata related to the tweets would help me be more convinced about that, or would shed light on an alternative hypothesis, which is that they're trying to maintain influence, that the goal of the troll farm is to create influence with a subset, actually a pretty small subset of US citizens. And they don't actually care about swaying public opinion broadly. They care about swaying public opinion in a pretty narrow but vocal and perhaps influential set of folks.
Or they're paid to stay in the game, or they are paid to
Yeah, okay. So maybe they're also trying to
remain relevant.
A third hypothesis is that they just lose their jobs if the operation goes away, and they're like, what do I do to keep being a Russian troll? No, I like that. It sounds funny, but I'm not discounting it. I think that's real, and okay. So these are three then hypotheses. Thanks, Nosley, for adding to the pool here. Here's how I think the tweets could help. So metadata about how viral these tweets went. Like, if these actually did reach enough people to plausibly sway US public opinion, I would change my mind, but I don't think they did. And so I guess that's an empirical question, is how many people did they reach? If the goal is then to maintain influence, then I would expect actually learning and mimicry of the existing discourse. So my understanding is that the way I think about the trolls, and I may be wrong, is that they were basically trying to mimic discourse that was happening in the US to some extent, but shift it in a particular direction and amplify what were extreme minority voices and make it seem like there were just a lot more people on the internet who thought that, so that people in an echo chamber were like, well, yeah, of course, you know.
So that's part of muddy the water, or is it distinct?
I think muddy the water is not a well-specified term, so I don't know what that means. I would just say that I think it means convincing people who are in an echo chamber that there are more of them, so that my opinion is not as fringe as I think it is. If that's muddying the water, then sure, I'm happy
I
to.
thought muddying the water was the messaging, but it's not my word either.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't mean to criticize the word either. I just think that, like,
Yeah.
I don't know what muddying the water means exactly. I think it can mean multiple things. I mean something specific, which is
I take it back. Sorry.
changing my, as a recipient of these messages, changing my belief about how many other people on the internet believe this, and thus how reasonable it is, and that's what keeping the operation alive looks. Now, I've talked for too long and we've incorporated too many ideas. What do you think about these tweets? You know, how much reach they have, and whether that could help you adjudicate between, and whether there's learning between them? Like, do they mimic existing tweets? Do they put a tweet out that goes viral and then they mimic the language in that tweet later on, et cetera? I think those would help adjudicate here.
No, that would be sort of interesting to look at. I mean, I still have those tweets, and then I can tell sort of how viral.
Okay, so you can see that metadata.
I haven't looked at it yet, but I mean, I can go and look, and then maybe add that to it to sort of buttress the idea that they're trying to influence. But in that case, sort of to your point, that they're trying to reach sort of a particular niche, group in there. To what end would that be? Because why would I care then about just trying to reach just these 16 people and just convince them that?
Oh, I'd say a bigger group than 16, a smaller
Yeah,
group
I mean,
than that would change an election, that would change what the US government is actually going to do in retaliation.
I think if I understood you right, it was more to not just create doubt from the outside, but also create doubt from the inside. Right.
That's
So
how it
like,
was-
so you're sort of, then you're amplifying voices inside that are inside the United States that are going to be critical.
I would
We'll
consider
go,
that
that's what I
as
think.
muddying the water, actually. Creating doubt is precisely that.
Yes, but if we're creating doubt, isn't that in service of, because that's how I'm interpreting it, like it's in service of preventing further action against, right?
Yeah, so I guess the question is by what mechanism? So is it that those people become stronger Trump supporters, for example, seemed like a thing that the troll farms are trying to get. Does that actually change what the US does in terms of retaliating? I'm not so convinced. Does it change the probability that a certain congressional race goes a certain way in the future? Like maybe, right? Without changing that probability of retaliation for this particular attack. That's, I guess, the distinction I'm getting at. But maybe it's not a clear distinction. I mean, the fact that I'm an outsider to this literature, so.
Yeah.
Anything more you'd like to add?
Oh,
on
yeah,
this?
no, I mean, I think it'll be interesting to look at. I think certainly I could look at sort of how viral it is, how many people did it reach, and then sort of try to see how influential were these tweets, and then maybe use that sort of as.
I was hoping I wasn't asking you to do more data
Oh,
collection.
no.
I need more data collection.
You didn't ask him write a different paper either. So. Let's see here. Diana.
Great. Hi, I'm Diana. I'm a third-year PhD in the department. My question actually falls on from Rich also. I actually was going to ask the reach question. So I have a couple questions regarding your data structure and the empirics of your analysis. So I was curious, if I remember correctly from the slides, you seem to have 3,800 something tweets from 180 something accounts over the span of 10 years. if I just do an average of that, that's like almost like one account, 2 tweets per year. That seems like a very sparse frequency of tweeting from trolls. If they try to create noise to this pool, to create kind of inject their voices, that does not sound like a very convincing or very heavy hitting kind of troll move I would expect from, just like Twitter bots, for example. So I was curious, what do you think are the intrinsic link between this account? What are they who are the kind of entities behind this account that are pushing this very few tweets onto this English speaking platform? And are these 3,000 something tweets in threads, or are they like single tweets that span out like once every month, every couple months? Then that would be very different from if I'm tweeting like 10 tweets a day, like, just right before election. So I'm like curious, what is the nature of this data set that you have?
The tweets are from sort of particular sort of these troll accounts. They tweet on a whole range of issues, right? So this subset is essentially just looking at cyber-related tweets, but there is a whole broader sort of scope of tweets that happens, right, on sort of a variety of topics. And some of it is in Russian, some of it is in other languages. These are just the sort of small English-speaking subset of it. And a lot of them also sort of, especially when it comes to the cyber issue, will oftentimes sort of lie dormant, and then you will see the spike in the tweet when there is something in the news relating to that. So, a particular account will not tweet for a long time, and then there's a news report about sort of a Russian hack, and then on that one day, that particular account will put out like 20 tweets, and then will go dormant again, right? So you have that spike.
Okay. Am I allowed to follow up on my question?
Quickly.
Okay. And so on your point about coordination of their tweeting strategies, my question is like also, there are only so many strategies when you want to refute a claim. And so on your network graph, where there are different strategies, maybe similar tweets accounts use the same strategies, I'm curious whether they're really connected or coordinated as you claim, or are they just, this is the entire space of possible strategies and we're seeing all of them?
No, the nodes there were just the various topics, and then the sort of coordination was which tweets are tweeting on these particular topics, right? So it was more about which tweets are putting out information on a particular topic, right? So there are certain accounts that are tweeting particular topics, and that's the sort of linkages. That's how the clusters form.
You need a two-finger?
Super quick follow-up. Just curious about data structure in the model. A number of the examples you showed us were retweets from other accounts, like there's one from like Nigel Farage. And I was wondering if your model treats retweets differently than original tweets.
No, in this sense, I suspect that those retweets are sort of part of the strategy that they adopt to avoid getting banned. So if they specifically look for content that sort of essentially puts out the kind of message that they would want to put out, and then retweet that rather than putting out an original tweet, because that original tweet then increases the likelihood that that account is flagged and banned. But if I'm just retweeting, then it reduces that likelihood. So I think that is a way for them to sort of get around.
So Nigel Farage is very useful. Let's see, Raymond Wong.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I'm a fourth year in the program. 2 questions. First is there a systematic difference between official and unofficial accounts? Like in one slide you sort of hint at official, this division between official and unofficial, but you only present findings for unofficial tweets. And, I'm just curious, why didn't you run the same tests on sort of Russian official accounts in response to this, and whether or not you would expect any systematic differences across the two? The second question is kind of building on, I think, Rich and Eric's point about the goal of these influence operations, right? Not to like add another hypothesis, but I will add another hypothesis, right? It seems that having this it seems the whole purpose of this kind of operation is to basically kind of the thin veneer of a plausible deniability of like it's not plausible at all. Like that's kind of the point, right? Like it's sort of exerting, oh, I did it, and I know I did it, but you can't prove it, right? Like that's kind of the point. And I would submit to you that it seems like this is kind of a signaling tool. I'm not familiar with the Russian case, but I think in China's case, sometimes, especially when it comes to like sort of informal economic like trait limitations, right? Like, oh, suddenly we're really concerned with this kind of bacteria on Norwegian salmon, right? Like that kind of thin veneer is the point of like, oh, like why we're doing this, but you can't prove explicitly why, like this is the reason why we're doing this. And that's kind of a signaling tool to either a domestic audience or like a broader international audience. So that's just one, and to sort of test that hypothesis, you would have to like look at whether Russia, in this case, sort of domestically uses this and kind of gloats about it of like, oh, look, right, like they can't prove we did it, but everybody knows we did it, right? So that's two.
Yeah. In terms of the official versus unofficial, here I mainly look at the unofficial tweets. I'm particularly interested in the activity of trolls, and so I don't look at, say, maybe sort of official Russian government tweets and so on. I mean I could look at that and then sort of compare that to this, but that would be sort of a separate data collection. The data I have is one that has been flagged by Twitter itself as being for the unofficial tweets. The official sort of response that I look at, which is just the sort of mainstream media response that the government puts out. Oftentimes, maybe a high-ranking government official is approached for comment on the accusation, and then they would just deny it. Or sometimes they would claim that these hackers are just sort of patriots who are just doing their part to help their country and so forth, right? So those are basically just the official. I didn't look at the official sort of tweets and see. And oftentimes, really, most countries just don't comment at all on the accusations. Again, I suspect part of that is just we don't want to sort of give any credence to it, because if we respond to it, it makes it seem like this is a legitimate accusation that deserves to be taken seriously. So if they treat it in a very sort of dismissive way, but then sort of in the sort of the end, they use sort of trolls sort of actively to try to inject or at least try to influence public opinion in that sense. So.
I've got two folks left on my list. A bunch of folks that go to class. They're not voting with their feet. But maybe I'll group them and ask their questions together. So Suzanne and then Isle, if you both want to ask your questions, then you can turn it back to you for final responses.
Sure. Well, thank you for a really interesting talk. I'm Suzanne. I'm a fourth-year PhD student. This might not be a fair question with the Twitter data set, but I'm curious, sort of, does an understanding of post-attribution behavior tell us anything about how these Russian entities actually work? Is there any ability to distinguish strategies pursued by different entities, like the Internet Research Agency versus, say, the GRU or FSB? And sort of like the difference being that, like, the GRU and FSB being like officially government, and like the Internet Research Agency being run by like an oligarch who's close to the government, but who's sort of also competing in his interests with government groups. Because I think what's really interesting about 2016 is that you have different entities that did different things, And it's unclear whether or not there was cooperation or competition between them, or like cooperation was a happy accident. And so I'm curious, sort of, if you're able to see any kind of distinguishing features between groups, or is it really just that the Twitter data is using all internet research agencies?
No, the Twitter data doesn't specify, unfortunately, which ones are internet sort of research agency proxies and which ones belong to the DRU. So it's all in there. All that we get, the information we have is that these are state-sponsored accounts, and we have banned them from the account and we have removed their tweets. But here are the tweets along with sort of a little bit of metadata on when the tweets happened, and do with it what you will, right? But it's not that fine grained for you because that would be really, really interesting to look into, right? To see how are they different, right? How is the sort of government entities different from the private proxies? Is there competition between them? Are they trying to outdo each other? Those are questions that I'm very interested in, but unfortunately, the data doesn't allow you to answer.
Quick question about the data set. It was my first time seeing this and it's really interesting. I'm curious if you have any hypotheses about sort of which tweets Twitter is better at finding and putting into this data set and which ones sort of slip through their filters.
That's interesting.
That would go, again, that would be very interesting, right? But that would require access to the entire universe to see which ones they flagged and which ones slip through. Right? Unfortunately, we only have access to the ones that they flagged, and so we can't tell which ones are getting, that are not being flagged, right? So, but that would be very interesting. It would be, if they are listening, it would be really interesting for them to give us the entire data set. I mean, give you and I think maybe some researchers might have access to that. So, but that's something. This is again my sort of foray into this as well. So as I work more on this, I'll dig in deeper. Maybe they'll give me the data.
Well, I did just hear a chirp, so. I will, please join me, everyone, in thanking William for an absolutely terrific talk.
Thanks for the talk. I have to run, but I'm gonna send you an email right now.
Please,
So.